In September 1704, a 28-year-old man was left on an island in the middle of the Pacific with a musket, a knife, a cooking pot, a few clothes, and a Bible. The ship that abandoned him was rotting from the inside out. He had warned them about it, argued with the captain, demanded repairs. When the captain refused, he made a bet that sounded insane. He would rather stay alone on the island than die aboard a doomed ship. The captain accepted the bluff, and when the boat began pulling away from the shore, Selkirk ran into the water screaming to be taken back. The captain ignored him. The ship disappeared beyond the horizon, and Alexander Selkirk stood there on the sand, watching his only way out of the world vanish. He would remain there for 4 years and 4 months, and the ship that abandoned him sank only a few months later, exactly as he had predicted, taking almost the entire crew down with it. This is the story of a man who had to lose everything: the ship, civilization, and eventually even his sanity, to discover who he really was. Alexander Selkirk was born in Scotland in 1676, the son of a shoemaker. And from an early age, he was the kind of person who made life impossible for himself and everyone around him. At 17, he was summoned to court for indecent behavior inside a church. Instead of showing up, he went to sea. He returned years later with an even worse temper, attacked his own brother during an argument over nothing, and when trouble with the authorities came again, he went back to sea for good. He was a legalized pirate. England was at war with Spain, and ships willing to attack enemy vessels received official permission from the government, a license to steal with the blessing of the crown. Selkirk was good at it. The problem was that his greatest enemy was not the Spanish, it was his own captain. In 1703, he joined an expedition as sailing master aboard the Cinque Ports, commanded by the young and inexperienced Thomas Stradling. The two hated each other. The expedition became a chain of disasters: lost battles, men dying from scurvy, and a ship slowly taking on water while Stradling pretended everything was fine. Selkirk understood ships. It was his vocation, the only area of his life where his difficult personality gave way to genuine competence. And what he saw in the Cinque Ports was a hull infested with shipworms, creatures that eat living wood, a ship that needed real repairs, not temporary patches. When they anchored at the island of Tierra, 650 kilometers off the coast of Chile, Selkirk confronted Stradling. Then came another argument, and then the bet that changed everything. He would rather stay on the island than die aboard a condemned ship. Stradling accepted. What Selkirk didn't know was that he was about to spend nearly 5 years completely alone, and that this forced isolation would transform him into a legend that would survive centuries after his death. The first days were absolute despair. Selkirk sat on his chest of belongings by the shore and stared at the horizon. He barely slept, barely ate. He was convinced Stradling would realize his mistake and come back. When hunger became impossible to ignore, he dragged himself across the beach gathering shellfish and stranded fish. But even then he stayed near the shore. He did not want to miss a passing ship. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. No ship came. Tierra was small, mountainous, covered in forest, and completely uninhabited. Surrounded by hundreds of kilometers of open Pacific in every direction, it was literally the kind of place most maps barely bothered to include. What finally forced him inland was the arrival of mating season for the sea lions. Thousands of them took over the beach, animals far too large for one man to confront alone. Selkirk had no choice. For the first time since arriving, he entered the forest, and that was when the island revealed what it had been hiding. The interior of the island was generous in a way the beach had never been. There were wild goats, left behind by Spanish explorers decades earlier as living food supplies for lost sailors, along with wild turnips, native cabbage, peppers, figs, and blackberries. The shoreline crawled with lobsters. Fresh water was abundant. Selkirk built 2 huts from pimento trees, one for sleeping, one for cooking. He learned how to make fire by friction. When his gunpowder finally ran out and he could no longer use his musket, he learned to chase goats across rocky terrain until they became trapped, and then threw himself onto them in brutal hand-to-hand struggles that left his body covered in scratches, but worked. Over time, he became agile enough to capture them alive, keep them in small enclosures, and use them for milk. When his clothes rotted away, he sewed new ones from goat skins using a needle from his navigation kit. When his tools wore down, he reshaped metal hoops abandoned by previous ships into knives. But the island was not always generous. One afternoon, while chasing a large goat across a steep hillside, Selkirk slipped and fell from a cliff. He lay motionless for 2 entire days. He could not call for help because there was nobody there to hear him. He survived only because the goat had landed before him and partially softened the fall. One accident, saving him from another. When he finally managed to stand, his ribs throbbed with every breath. He dragged himself back to the hut. After that day, he began carving his name and the date of his arrival into the trees surrounding the camp. It was the closest thing to a gravestone he could leave behind, in case someone one day found the shelters and wondered who had built them. The rats became his most persistent problem. They infested everything edible and attacked him while he slept. The solution came from a simple observation. There were hundreds of wild cats on the island, descendants of animals brought by ships. Selkirk captured kittens and raised them. Before long, the cats controlled the rats, and he could finally sleep. The first 18 months pushed him to the edge of collapse. Not the loud kind of collapse, the other kind. The silent kind that arrives slowly like a tide. Selkirk spent entire days talking to himself, not because he wanted to, but because absolute silence was unbearable. On the longest nights, he heard voices among the trees, footsteps that never arrived. His mind tried to fill the emptiness the only way it knew how, by inventing presences. Sometimes he woke in the middle of the night convinced someone was standing outside, and discovering once again that nobody was there always hit him the same way, like a punch to the chest. There were moments when he considered simply stopping. The effort felt too large for the reward. Another identical day, another identical night, the same empty horizon. It was in this state that the cats became more than a solution to the rats. They became companionship, real presence, warmth, movement. Selkirk began teaching the cats to dance, not because he expected them to learn, but because the act of teaching, repeating, and watching something react, anything react, filled something inside him that no survival skill could. The hut where he slept slowly filled with cats. He did not mind. Every morning and every night he recited a psalm aloud, not only because of faith, but because he needed to hear human words, even if they were his own, to remind himself he still belonged to the world of men. And then around the 18th month, something changed. Not happiness, something harder to describe, a kind of forced peace, a reconciliation with reality. He knew every inch of the island. He knew where the sunlight touched first in the morning and where the shadows lasted longest. He knew the smell of the forest before rain. Without realizing it, he had stopped being a man waiting to be rescued and had become part of the island itself. In January 1709, 2 ships appeared on the horizon. Selkirk had learned to be cautious. A few years earlier, a Spanish vessel had anchored near the island. Capture would have meant imprisonment in a gold mine in Peru. Conditions so brutal he would have chosen death on the island 1,000 times over. He hid in a tree while Spanish sailors searched beneath him without ever looking up. After they left, he climbed down with shaking hands. This time, the ships carried English flags. Selkirk lit a fire on the beach and fed it through the entire night, terrified it might die before being seen. By morning, when a small boat approached the shore, he ran into the water screaming. The sailors found a man with a thick beard, dressed entirely in goatskins, barefoot and hardened, his eyes carrying something difficult to describe. Part desperation, part determination, part whatever happens. To someone who spends years alone and stops being exactly the same person they once were. When he tried to speak, his first words came out broken. His tongue had grown stiff, unaccustomed to complete sentences. The captain was Woodes Rogers, and the pilot was William Dampier. The same Dampier from the original expedition, the same man indirectly connected to the chain of events that had led to Selkirk's abandonment. Rogers was astonished by Selkirk's calmness. The years on the island had erased every trace of impulsiveness, replacing it with a patience rarely seen at sea. He never lost his temper. He solved problems with a serenity Rogers later described as extraordinary. Rogers made him second mate. Before leaving, Selkirk hunted goats to feed the starving crew. Then he boarded the ship, and the island slowly disappeared behind him. Selkirk returned to the world as though he had never left. He continued working as a privateer and accumulated nearly 800 pounds, the equivalent of hundreds of thousands of dollars today. When he finally arrived in England in 1711, his story had reached the country before he had. Captain Rogers had documented everything. A journalist named Richard Steele later interviewed him and published an article that spread throughout the city. During one interview, Selkirk said something people would repeat for centuries. "I am now worth 800 pounds, but I was never happier than when I possessed not a single penny." Daniel Defoe read about him. In 1719, he published Robinson Crusoe, moving the story to the Caribbean, extending the isolation from 4 years to 28, and adding Friday as a companion. The novel became one of the best-selling books in the history of English literature and is still read more than 300 years later. But the real Selkirk never fully adapted to life on land. Crowds made him restless. Social rules felt artificial. In 1717, he returned to the sea as an officer in the Royal Navy. In December 1721, while serving off the western coast of Africa, he contracted yellow fever. He died at 45 years old and was buried at sea. The man who survived nearly 5 years alone on a Pacific island died from a virus no survival skill in the world could have prevented. In the 1960s, the Chilean government renamed Maz a Tierra. Today, it is called Isla Robinson Crusoe. Selkirk's name was given instead to the smaller island in the archipelago, one he most likely never even visited. And that leaves one final question. Honestly. Not the answer you think you should give. The answer you truly believe. If you were in Selkirk's place, a rotting ship behind you, an irresponsible captain, a deserted island on one side, and the open ocean on the other, what would you have chosen? Would you board the ship and trust the sea? Or stay on the island and gamble that someone would eventually come? Because the answer says far more about you than you probably realize.